So I didn't know Michael, and I'm a therapist newbie, but a reoccurring theme, both outside today's session and then in today's session, especially in the breakout group, that always seems to come up that originates with his work is the respectfulness, the importance of having respect for clients and them knowing that that's not something that's always found in this profession. And not that narrative, has a hold on that, but this way of working certainly seems to privilege respecting the client and their story and their choices.
Yeah, so a few years ago, Lorraine Hedke and John Winsley came to Winnipeg, and I was explaining to John and Lorraine that I'd gotten into narrative after Michael had passed away, and so we were really talking about how my experience with narrative was really very much a remembering experience. I remember a story that David Epstein had told about, Michael and David going to do a presentation at a hospital. After the presentation, when Michael and David were returning home on the bus, David noticed that, that Michael wasn't really all that happy, and he asked him what was going on, and he said, it's not about me showing respect; it's about the people that I'm with experiencing respect, and that's always played a big, since hearing that story and meeting Michael through his writing and his teaching, that's always played a big part in my life, professionally and personally. One of the questions I had asked in the group was, getting to know narrative and meeting some of the writer thinkers who are kind of leading the way in narrative therapy. Everyone's always been very accessible through emails and at workshops. And as someone who never met Michael, I was wondering what he was like to approach at a workshop, or what he was like to correspond with through email. And so that was a question I wanted to ask the people that knew Michael.
One time at this Evolution of Psychotherapy gathering, Walter, Vera, and I spent some time with Michael having a drink ahead of time to prepare for his talk with Salvador Minuchin, because he was quite worried about it. And he was like a rock star at this gathering. Wherever he went, there were all these people following him everywhere. And Walter said to him, if you like, I could be kind of like your bodyguard. I could come and I could help people, move you somewhere. So at the end of the workshop, so you must be exhausted because you have to go from person to person or workshop to workshop.
I said your handler, right?
Your handler.
Yeah.
And Michael paused and he said, thank you very much. But at the end, he had a schedule that was wild, like 6 things that day. And he said, the people that come up to me at the end of the workshop, they usually have gifts for me, not just gifts in terms of material things, but they have things they've thought about that they really want to share with me. And I would like to hear them. I'm grateful for those moments, and I just would not want to give them up.
Wow. Special. Yeah. I never knew Michael either, only through some of his writing. I haven't had a chance to read most of it. I'm just started out as an intern, and as I was explaining earlier, that I was interested in narrative therapy because it opened up the opportunity for the underprivileged, the disenfranchised to tell their story. And I was just wondering, what about him, in the opinion of those that knew him, enabled him to embody such a person-centered, culture-centered approach to therapy? Where did that, looking back in his life, where would you say that came from?
I could respond in part to that. Michael's been, has written, I think, somewhere about how he did come from a really working class background, and felt the consequences of that in the schooling that was available to him. And also in his family environment, it hadn't, his dad, it wasn't the best relationship, and so he formed understandings of how the world was and how it should be, and expressions of power over, and how that wasn't the way to go very early on. I think it is, that understanding, or that appreciation, or being able to be in the shoes of others, is very deeply there. And then also the whole political, he was studying at uni, part-time. He could only study part-time over many years, because he had to work to cover his fees and his living. It was the time of the Vietnam War and the anti-war demonstrations, and he was very active in that, and about the politics of life, and taking a stand against expressions of power, I think.
Michael's relationship with his mother, you'll see there's a connection there that's really quite lovely and profound and playful, but very meaningful as well.
I remember that Michael often spoke about his relationship with women in his family history, and about his sister and their relationship, and his awareness of the extreme patriarchal values of his working class upbringing. He would tell stories about the stories he told his daughter, where he made up female characters that were superheroes, because he was aware that there had been so few examples available. And so I know that women had a powerful influence, in my experience, a powerful influence over how Michael thought about and responded to those who were disempowered, and wanted to center their stories in their lives.
I didn't know Michael personally, but I saw many of his trainings, and when he was in the Northeast of the US. And I was always struck by both his brilliance and his humble humanness, that he just was committed to just being a human among humans, not more, not less, just we are all here finding our way. But also, every action seemed to be deeply informed by his deep, rich understanding of how we make sense of the world.